It is 3 o'clock, and so I'm going to go ahead and kick us off and get started here. I know we have one panelist who's on his way in, but we don't want to keep our adoring fans waiting, of course. So we'll go ahead and get started. Thank you, everybody. Welcome, and thanks for joining us today. The title of today's webinar is Creating a Win-Win: How Communities and Affordable Housing Developers Can Partner for Success. Please feel free to post your questions in the chat. We'll try to wrap up with time to answer some of them at the end. We might answer some of them as we go along. We'll see how that goes. And a quick reminder to everybody who's here today, today's webinar is going to be recorded, and that recording will be available tonight on the TPMA website, so look for that. I'll also try to post it to my LinkedIn and everything like that and send it around to our panelists today. So in order to get started here, just a quick kind of intro to what we're looking forward to talking about today. You know, one of the most common recommendations that we make to communities who are interested in addressing their affordable housing needs is to convene conversations with developers to get a sense of what barriers might exist that are making it difficult to build in their area. Developers bring a unique and critically important perspective to these issues. And if communities aren't in dialogue with them, they are likely unaware of the full range of factors that are contributing to their affordability challenges. Occasionally, once we've made this recommendation, we hear back, that sounds great. How do we do that? And so I think that that's a great place to start with today's conversation with our amazing group of panelists. Before I ask them to answer that question, though, let me introduce them to you. On our panel today, we're honored to have subject matter experts who have backgrounds in community development, economic development, affordable housing development, workforce development, real estate analysis, regional partnerships, local and county government, and actually a lot more. And amazingly and happily to say, we found just 3 people to cover all of those bases for us today. And they are Andrea Davis. Although she has been with the company for nearly 10 years, Andrea has served as the executive director of HAND Incorporated since 2020. Initially launched in 2003 as the Hamilton County Area Neighborhood Development Incorporated. This nonprofit organization has served Hamilton County and beyond by offering down payment and closing cost assistance, owner-occupied housing rehab, and by developing single and multi-family homes for low to moderate income households and seniors. Since 2020, HAND has also served as a founding member of the Hamilton County Housing Collaborative. Through their 20-plus year history, HAND has developed housing in Noblesville, Sheridan, Carmel, and Fishers, Indiana. I had the pleasure of working with Andrea on a collaborative project with the Tipton County Foundation in Tipton, Indiana as well, where HAND has also developed a neighborhood of age and income restricted single family homes. Andrea, good to see you again, and thanks for joining us.
Thanks.
Next up is Mark Perlman, the Division Director for the Equitable Housing and Community Development with Wake County, North Carolina's Housing Affordability and Community Revitalization Department. That's a long title, Mark. Mark has spent the last 5 years working in affordable housing for local government in the state's capital region with both Wake County and the city of Raleigh. Prior to moving to North Carolina, Mark lived in the Washington, D.C. area, where he worked in valuation for Novogradac and Company, as well as the National Community Land Trust Network and the Federal Housing Finance Agency. Mark received his Master's of Public Policy from the University of Maryland School of Public Policy and is a graduate of the national champion, Ohio State University. Mark, good to see you again, and thanks for being here. And finally, we're thrilled to be joined by Ryan Twiss, who just this month, this is an interesting time for Ryan, just this month stepped down from his position as VP of Regional Initiatives with NEI and Executive Director of the Northeast Indiana Regional Development Authority to help launch an exciting new project with Mission Build, which will partner with local governments, economic development groups, and community-based organizations nationwide to implement sustainable housing production strategies. Ryan has spent the better part of 2 decades working on regional efforts around economic development, workforce development, community development, and much more in the Northeast Indiana region. We're excited to have him join us today and see if he can lend us some of that extensive experience, lend it to this conversation. Ryan, thank you for taking the time and joining us today. Okay, so with that, I was hoping we could start off by talking a little bit about how the process that leads to developers and local or regional governments working together on affordable housing development, how that process kind of kicks off. Andrea, if you don't mind, I'd like to start with you. How do you typically begin work when you work with a community? For instance, do they contact you directly? How does that look from your end?
That's sort of a dream of ours, that a community would reach out and say, hey, we have a need for affordable housing, come help us fill it. In reality, it's often the opposite. Oftentimes it doesn't necessarily always occur to a municipality that they need a range of housing options until we educate them about that. So from our perspective, it usually starts with us. We're looking for opportunities, right? The few successes we've had working with municipalities, we have gone to them saying, hey, we see that this opportunity exists. How about letting us become a part of it? And it's worked out.
That's great, thanks. I'm wondering, Mark, actually, if you don't mind jumping in next, how have you seen or been involved with the kind of impetus, right, to start those conversations? What's that look like from your end?
So I've seen a number of examples of both local governments approaching developers and vice versa. And so we work with municipalities in Wake County that are in very different stages of engaging with affordable housing. And we have seen a number of municipalities, when they're just kind of dipping their toe into the water, wanting to learn more. Hey, we believe this is an issue. We're hearing it from our constituents. How do we learn more, and how do we address this issue in our community? Sometimes their first stop is the affordable housing development community. We have some longstanding affordable housing partners that we've worked with that are known regionally and that serve as kind of subject matter experts and a resource. On the flip side, we've also seen many municipalities kind of similarly, if they've started engaging with negotiations with developers around affordability, they will engage with that through the entitlement process to work with developers to negotiate for affordability. And then, of course, you also have many municipalities who are kind of forward thinking when they engage in formal processes, whether it is adopting an affordable housing plan, inviting developers to participate in steering committees, or having them be consulted as part of the plan development process, or even once you've gotten past that point and you have formal programs that have been implemented. For example, if there are disposition processes for publicly owned land, or if there are gap financing programs, oftentimes units of government, of course, need to be outward facing and actively soliciting proposals from developers for that. So from my perspective, I've been able, and I think very fortunate, to see the whole range of interactions between local governments and developers flowing in both directions.
Just curious, Mark, are any of those kinds of approaches seem to be smoother? I don't want to say more successful necessarily, but is there kind of an ideal way that you've kind of seen some of these conversations be initiated?
So I will answer from the perspective of somebody working in local government, and yes, I'm very interested to hear from my fellow panelists working in the development community. I think from the perspective of local government, the ideal process is for a community to establish what its goals are before really engaging with the development community. What are your specific concerns that you're trying to address in your community? Are there priority populations that you're trying to serve? And then formulate your goals and a plan around that. I think it's extremely important for the development community to be a part of that process to inform how feasible your goals and objectives really are. But I think starting with the goals first as a community and then reaching out for partnerships to help accomplish those goals, to me, I think that's kind of the ideal sequence of events.
I think that sounds about right from the experiences we've had as well. Ryan, I'm wondering, a lot of experience you have is with this kind of regional initiatives. I'm wondering, is it the same as kind of Andrea and Mark have already talked about, as from the developer and the kind of local or county government? How have you seen this kind of kick off from a regional perspective?
Well, maybe I shouldn't have accepted this invitation, because I will just clarify one little point about the work that we've been doing here. A lot of our efforts in Northeast Indiana that we're now kind of trying to roll out well beyond are focused more on market rate housing, but as a strategy to open up more affordable units that are currently occupied by folks that don't have that sort of missing middle inventory to move into. So from our perspective, most of our conversations have gone exactly the way that Mark has described them, where it starts with the local community having a conversation about what its housing goals are, and what its community growth goals are, and what role housing plays in that, and begin looking at one of the things that we tend to start with is a market potential analysis for a community. So rather than looking at what the historical market comps have said a community should be building, we're looking at what people who may want to be relocating or may want to be upgrading or downsizing in a community are actually looking for, who those potential home buyers are, what their sort of demographic, age, employment level, income level is. And then you can begin to set strategies based on the growth potential as opposed to simply just the historic performance. And then that's when the development community can really come in. And to Mark's point, say if it's feasible, but also we sort of believe that nothing is impossible. It just may require some more creative capital stacking to get some of those projects over the finish line, rather than just having a developer come in and say, well, here's what I can get from traditional financing, here's what I'm putting in as equity, and here's what my gap is, local community fill it for me.
I want to first off, Ryan, I'm glad you accepted the invite for today, and I actually want to get here in just a little bit to some of those maybe more creative concepts and approaches. But before we do that, market rate housing is obviously a critical part in trying to understand and address some of these needs as well, right? So I guess one of the things that you've kind of stumbled on is maybe a favorite talking point of mine, which is what I like to call kind of housing life cycle, or the different sets of needs, right? The different members of our community when it comes to housing. So I think you mentioned a little bit about missing middle or kind of filling those gaps. I wonder actually if you could talk a little bit about some of the challenges that maybe you've encountered, or what's keeping that gap in place? What's keeping the middle missing, I guess? What are some of those challenges that we're hoping to overcome in that case?
Well, I mean, I think it's purely, in a lot of ways, just a numbers game, where in today's environment, I assume it's like this in other parts of the country, but it certainly is in Indiana, Northeast Indiana. It costs more to build a $250,000 home than you can sell a that costs more than $250,000 to build a $250,000 home. And so it's just kind of impossible to really get to that missing middle or even 300,000 kind of price point up to that and still have it be feasible for a developer to do in a traditional kind of market driven sense. It just doesn't make it. I had a mixed use developer tell me the other day as we were talking about gaps and all of that. He said, look, if I'm going to make 5% margin on this, why wouldn't I put my money into a money market account as opposed to taking on this big risk to build a apartment complex in your community? I said, that's a great point. So there is a real gap there, but we have to figure out creative ways to fill it so it's not just the local community writing that check every single time.
Absolutely. And I think so and I guess that's the next question then, and I want to throw this to you, Andrea. If we can't find a way to finance market rate housing in that kind of missing middle, how does that challenge kind of even more of an issue or a barrier that you've seen in affordable housing? And then maybe if you want to take us to the next question, what are you doing about it?
Well, I think actually affordable housing has an advantage over market rate housing because we get subsidy, right? I mean, we get grants and low interest loans that we can put in our capital stack to make the numbers work that they wouldn't work otherwise. I mean, these product wouldn't be built, because if it costs, $300,000 to build a $250,000 home, that's no margin, right? You're losing money. So, I think we have an advantage in that regard, but we still have to think creatively. To Ryan's point, it's not, it used to be we'd get this grant and this loan and a small bank loan and we're good. And now we're talking about multiple grants with different, regulatory requirements. And of course, every funder has their own priorities in terms of what population they want you to serve, which, you're high as a developer of affordable housing. We're highly encouraged through financial incentives to develop housing for the very poorest of the poor, which obviously has the greatest need. But those, not only do we lose money building it, but we lose money renting them. Like the rents for the very lowest income residents don't produce enough income to pay to operate the property. So those are the types of challenges we have to address. And I wish I had an answer. I mean, we had, in addition to identifying different funding sources, we also have to think about the construction process, and are there things we can change there, innovations we can find or efficiencies we can find that will lower our expenses. Because, we can't control the cost of lumber, and it's no cheaper to build an affordable 2-bedroom, 2-bathroom house than it is to build a market rate. I mean, yeah, maybe some of the finishes are going to be a little bit, but the lumber costs the same, the plumbing costs the same, the HVAC costs the same. It's no, somebody asked me the other day, like, what does it cost to build an affordable house? I'm like, it costs the same as it does to build a market rate house. We just can't charge our end users the same amount that market rate developers can. So I hope that answered your question.
Andrea, I'd challenge that theory a little bit, that with a lot of the funding sources, it's almost more expensive in many cases, to build affordable housing than it is to build market rate, because of the labor costs tied to Davis-Bacon and things like that.
Yeah, I will say, and that's probably like in the weeds for a lot of folks watching this, but we intentionally build projects that are below the Davis-Bacon threshold, which Davis-Bacon is a federal prevailing wage law that kicks in at 12 units. So when we are, trying to answer our community's need for affordable housing, we are artificially restricted to building 11 units or fewer at a time, because to build 12 would increase the cost. To your point, Ryan, that's not to say we're not paying people fairly in the smaller, it's just the increased paperwork and all, the regulatory requirements mean that the contractor is going to charge us more to do the same work, because they have all this paperwork they have to take care of. And that's something I think a lot of people don't think about when they layer all the regulations on the money we get, is how much it costs to actually follow the rules.
Well, this in fact is the perfect transition, actually, Andrea. So we talked about financing gaps, and we talked in some ways, or the difficulty in financing construction, labor costs, lumber costs, all of these kinds of things. But then you also mentioned that some of those are both financial, but there's also a kind of regulatory environment. There's other barriers that can exist. So Mark, not to put you on the spot and to answer for all of government here. That's certainly not what I intend to do. But I am wondering, what are maybe some of the other kinds of barriers that you've seen, some of the other challenges that are out there that are creating barriers in this space?
Sure. From a regulatory perspective, I think we've talked about, the conversation about the missing middle. I think land use law can be a barrier to creating more affordable housing. We work with a lot of communities that are bedroom communities that are now growing and urbanizing, but their UDOs are still very focused on large lot single family housing. And that is, of course, a barrier for so many communities. We also look at a lot of communities, and I think you see this everywhere in the country, just the entitlement process. There are fees that communities charge that may be needed for their infrastructure to be able to meet their growth goals, but they can really make it significantly more expensive to develop any kind of housing. And I think the key for us is building the understanding market rate developers have some more latitude to be able to accommodate some of those increased costs or the holding costs from, sort of a prolonged permitting process. Whereas an affordable housing developer, as Andrea mentioned, the cost that you can pass on to your end consumer is not really there. So being creative, I think, and I think this is the challenge that we see. I think there are a lot of communities out there that think, well, maybe we're a small community and we're never going to have the tax base to start up a gap financing program to make direct investments in affordable housing. It's not necessary to make direct, that's not your only option. There are a lot of other creative ways that you can use your land use regulations as well as your building and permitting processes, your building standards even, to promote greater residential development, which does help. I think filtering used to be a thing in this country. It might be interesting to see if we can build enough so that that can exist again, but it can certainly make it more feasible and more achievable to introduce more affordable housing units into your community.
I think this is one of the really interesting things as we kind of understand and already talked about kind of some of the timelines that are associated with like creating new housing, and they can be really lengthy, and policy can take time to change and adjust as well. But a lot of the challenges that we've already kind of talked about here, maybe specifically in some cases, issues around financing, are changing and worsening, I guess, if you want to say it, rapidly, right? I mean, there's a lot of these just in the last, say, handful of years have become even more and more and more difficult. Certainly, since before the pandemic till now, right? Which, who knows? Was that a long time ago? Is that not a long time ago? What is time anymore, right? Who can tell? But I do think that it can be a challenge for municipalities or local governments in some kind of ways to be in a position to be responsive and to kind of meet the pace at which some of these challenges are developing. Do you, I'm curious to know, first off, if there are some innovative examples that you're familiar with or you've seen or that you would suggest, not to maybe get too far in the policy weeds here, but I'd be curious to see what those are. And then kind of as a subset of that, have you seen communities that manage to be flexible, and allow themselves to be a little bit more responsive than others, and what allows them to do that?
Absolutely. So we do have a couple of examples locally. So for the group, I think we have folks from all over the country here. North Carolina is, of course, a Dillon Rule state. And so the authority that we have as units of local government to be flexible is really what we can do is directly dictated by the state legislature. So one, it's really important for folks in municipal government to build a solid understanding of what their rights and authorities are. To that end, to identify those windows they have for creativity. So the city of Raleigh, they implemented an expedited permit review process for affordable housing projects. So if you're a market rate project, you go through the typical review process, but if you're an affordable housing project, you get flagged at the very beginning, as soon as you submit your ASR, and then you are fast tracked. And they've been able to shave months off of that permit review process, which I don't know if there's anybody from Raleigh on the call. I hope not. Apologies if so, but Raleigh is notorious for the length of its time to issue permits. So this has been a huge advantage, significant cost savings for our affordable housing development partners. We've also seen, I referenced fees earlier. So in North Carolina, local governments do not have the right to levy income taxes. So we are reliant on property taxes, sales taxes, and development fees. And so many communities are really leaning into those development fees. But the state also dictates that you cannot waive those fees. However, there are creative ways to do, for example, fee reimbursements. And so one of our municipal partners has been able to reimburse some of its utility fees to give back to affordable housing developments, which, these may not be game-changing sums of money in the scope of $30-40 million development, but every little bit counts. So we've seen a lot of examples of creativity. And then at the county level on our end, one thing that we're seeing, I think somebody mentioned earlier that, it shouldn't necessarily fall to these local communities to be writing the check for every single affordable housing development. And we've run into that challenge. We actually developed an affordable housing preservation fund, which is a public-private partnership, which we seeded with local government capital and partnered with a CDFI who went out and fundraised from a number of banks. And so these types of partnerships can really creatively extend the impact of local government resources and maximize them and still be able to offer capital sources that are well below market rate and can support affordable housing development.
Thanks. Yeah, I know, we've been doing a lot of work around North Carolina and have become quite acquainted with North Carolina's particular flavor of Dillon's rule. Relationships, I guess maybe I'll say it that way. Andrea, I'm curious from the developer's side, and then Ryan, I'm coming to you after this. I'm wondering if you've seen in Indiana, where I know you do, I think all of work that HAND does, any of these kinds of policy changes make it easier and help address any of those challenges that we've already discussed here?
I have seen some positive examples that I'm hoping I will see closer to home soon. One that we host an annual suburban housing conference every year just to kind of try to educate the community about our needs and possible solutions. And last year we brought in the planning department from South Bend up in Northwest Indiana. They actually revised their zoning ordinance a few years ago to make the missing middle housing a little easier to build. I mean, I think Mark was pointing out, a lot of times the zoning laws just kind of are so focused, especially in communities like ours that are, former bedroom communities that are becoming economic engines. But, the single family half-acre lot, that's what our comp plans call for pretty much here. So South Bend revised their zoning policy to make it easier. They also they're more of an urban setting. They had a problem where 25% of their residential lots in the city were vacant. It's an older city. So they hired a couple architects and they designed a Sears catalog type array of 30 pre-approved building plans. So designed specifically for the lot sizes that you find in South Bend. And the majority of those vacant lots they were trying to fill. And so if you're a small scale developer, and that was to encourage small scale developers like HAND and just neighborhood developers, mom and pop that want to take some of their retirement savings and invest it, to invest in South Bend. And so, you talk about, shaving months off the permitting process. They have a commitment that if you choose one of the pre-approved building plans and make no changes to it, obviously they will approve that the same day. If you choose another residential building plan that isn't pre-approved, they give you a commitment within the same week. So, I mean, they are really motivated to get things built in South Bend. They're almost out of lots. I said 25% of their residential lots were vacant. They are almost out of city-owned lots that they can put to use this way. So that's a fabulous example that I would love to see happen in more places. Obviously that requires an upfront investment to, these are construction sets, so it's a savings for the developer, but also just the time that you save by being able to just go pick a design off a shelf and say, let's do that. I got my permit today. Let's build it next week. Closer to home here in Noblesville, the city of Noblesville. So Indiana in 2017 made inclusionary zoning illegal. And so, inclusionary zoning is one of the tools that affordable housing developers have elsewhere in the country. Communities can say, if you're going to build, homes in our community, a certain percentage of those need to be affordable or whatever. The state of Indiana, in its infinite wisdom, said, we don't want that here. So, but the city of Noblesville has figured out ways to leverage, their zoning approvals, say a developer wants more density than is allowed for in the zoning ordinance, or we had a case where a developer wanted to build an apartment building and a portion of the land it needed was city owned. So in order for the city to agree to sell that property, it said, hey, why don't you make 10% of the units in this building that you're going to build affordable? That's a step in the right direction, I think. I think it doesn't go far enough. I'm a developer, so I think, that's great that they recognize that there's a need for that. And I've talked to them about how they can do even better at that. And then I'll just mention one more thing, and it is public money, but I think it kind of gets kind of forgotten. But so the county where HAND does most of its work, Hamilton County, is an entitlement community for CDBG, Community Development Block Grant Fund. So we get our own allocation of CDBG funds here in Hamilton County. 40% of those come right off the top and go out to our 4 largest cities. And that was just kind of like, that's how we became an urban county, was these 4 large cities. And that was part of the initial deal when we applied to HUD for this funding. But we get $1 million total. And so 40% of that, $400,000 goes to the cities, the 4 cities. So let's say $100,000 each. That's not enough to really do anything. And so what happens is they end up sort of like saving that money until they have enough built up to like put in new sidewalks or some sort of infrastructure project in a low income neighborhood, because that money is intended to benefit low income folks. So one of the things we're doing is trying to reach out to those municipalities and say, let us help you spend your CDBG money. Instead of building a sidewalk that doesn't really need to be replaced, but you're going to do it because you have this money, why not use that $100,000 to help pay for some of the infrastructure for this affordable housing development? Because that's our biggest cost, right? We're going into places that don't have sewers and all that, like on the site. So could we redeploy these? And actually, I mean, the other thing is we're in a very affluent community, so we're kind of running out of low and mod neighborhoods to benefit. But, that money could be deployed in a different way, kind of like you were saying about some of the impact fees. That's another, some communities have said, if you're bringing seniors in, we maybe don't need to charge you the family with 6 kids rate on the park impact fees, right? So just things like that. I mean, but for any of that to happen, though, that there has to be that will and that recognition that we can't just have $500,000 homes in our community. And that's where we're struggling a little bit.
Yeah, and I think that goes back, to the beginning remarks that the first thing is you got to establish your goals. I think communities in Indiana can at least have some shared misery with communities in North Carolina as it comes to like, are there ways to get around the lack of permissions for inclusionary zoning. That's certainly something that we've talked a lot about in both states. I think, Ryan, I want to throw it over to you. I wonder, first off, there's a lot of these questions. You can answer any of them that we've asked, but I wonder if, there are examples you've seen or want to kind of talk about developers on one hand and governments or local officials on the other, coming together to kind of have those conversations. Either that's to establish that the need and what those goals are, or, overall just, hey, developer, what can we do to help you out in a lot of the ways that kind of Andrea just mentioned?
Yeah, that's a great question, actually, and good timing. So this new organization that I am helping kick off, Mission Build, we have a strategic partnership with Club 720 Solutions. This is a group. They've done a lot of work throughout Indiana, but really all over the country. They have a fintech platform that administers down payment assistance programs and helps do credit recovery and help buyer pipelines and savings courses and things like that. But they also do a lot of work and have historically done a lot of work in consulting with local communities to develop these housing strategies. So we've really found, the relationship pulling in the developers has been really helpful, but we have started with the local communities and helping them sort of, I don't know how to say this, but build a little self-confidence. I think I've watched in my previous life, we administered a large state grant program, the READY program, for those of you from Indiana that would be aware of it. And so we were making those grants and a lot of these conversations with with these communities and developers have been really interesting, but it does seem like there's still this fear that it's like 2018 again and nobody wants to come and build in your community, but it's just not really true anymore. And so anyway, that having to, as my new boss likes to say, you need communities with swagger and community leadership with swagger, because it starts there. And so I think really helping the local communities build some of that self-esteem, and then this proprietary kind of strategic framework that we use called the HOME method, which is housing optimization through market empowerment. It's really helping all of the players in the community realize what role they play in making these housing deals come to fruition. And it's not just everybody. We can all sit on the same side of the table. We don't have to be on opposite sides of the negotiating table every single time.
I think that's really true. And one of the things when it comes to kind of confidence, I guess, a lot of the communities we work with are just kind of starting to think about their role in housing for the first time. All of a sudden, it's maybe a couple of years or decades too late if you ask me, but, I think that a lot of approaches to housing has been, if you think we need it, you'll come build it and kind of take care of that problem for us. I think to a lot of what we've kind of talked about, I think that concept that maybe you'd call it, hands off, laissez-faire approach or something like that, is just, I think everyone's starting to realize that maybe that's not going to get it done as much. It's not as easy to kind of hold on to that concept. And a lot of communities are starting to realize they have to have a role in this process. Can you talk a little bit about maybe what that conversation looks like to kind of build that confidence? And maybe that's not exactly what you were talking about when you said confidence, but the understanding that yes, we can do something about this, and yes, we probably need to if we really want to be proactive in addressing these issues.
Historically, our region has really emphasized trying to stem population decline as a key community goal. And that happened. We were losing population pretty consistently till 2016, and then went on the uptick. And we are no Hamilton County, but we are one of the fastest growing metros in the Great Lakes region. And so kind of outkicking the coverage in terms of population retention and growth for a community of our size. And I think a lot of that did come down to just having some of that sense of swagger and talking about it, but really wanting to think about, okay, if we're gonna stop losing people, how are we gonna get more people here? If we're gonna get more people here, where are they gonna live? And so that was just the next day conversation. Yeah, we need to get more people. Shoot, my entire county has 12 houses on the MLS, and 6 of them have been on for 18 months because they're dilapidated or just never going to work. So it's like we have this crazy shortage, and how are we going to solve that? And I think the recognition that of the 11 counties that I've historically represented, 2 corners of one county are growing based on free market participation. So what do we need to do to help that? But I think it is helping communities understand, like, their communities are great. And if they want to reach their goals, they need to be kind of thoughtful and strategic about it, but they don't have to say, again, we'll just take whatever crappy greenfield development comes in with hollow core doors and laminate because they think that it needs to be on a half-acre lot. So they end up cutting all the costs on the interior when really they're trying to attract millennials and Gen Z who don't want any of that space. They want the nice finishes. So it's like the push and pull of what do you really want your community to be? And that's why we always start with that market potential analysis, is what could you be when you grow up, not what have you always been, and are you relegated to reliving that past?
Yeah, I think that's interesting. We've talked a lot about with communities about, yes, establishing a vision, right? Establishing goals. I think, Mark, to your point, Mark, North Carolina is not the same in Indiana in this sense, right? Well, maybe along the same timeline, but North Carolina is just growing and growing and growing almost in every single corner of the state for years now. So
he's literally fighting the sunshine off of his face.
How good we have it.
That's right. It's just it's so the future's so bright in North Carolina. But I wonder if there are ways that you have seen or maybe yourself been involved with kind of having those conversations with communities? Because I think to your point, before we can even think about working with developers, we kind of understand that maybe we need to do something, locally. And how has that conversation been going, if you've had it, or how have you seen that kind of undertaking?
So it's gone in a lot of different directions, and I have to say that I think that I'm fighting the sun off my face because it's reflecting off of our very unseasonal and our unusual snowfall that we just got over the past couple of days. But really, this discussion is kind of why long-range planners are some of my favorite people, because they're looking at those trends and thinking about the future of a community. And I think that's been kind of one of the challenges that we've encountered working with. We have sort of a divide. The western part of Wake County is very much rapidly urbanizing, much more affluent, and that's where a lot of our kind of high-tech service sector industry is located. East County is still characterized as a little more rural, but the growth is moving in that direction. And so when I think about helping communities build that swagger, which I really like that, Ryan, actually, thinking about it's less about thinking about the confidence, it's more getting communities to recognize what's coming in a very high growth area. So Wake County we are adding 51 people a day to the county population. We are the fastest growing county in North Carolina, one of the fastest growing in the country. And so it's getting communities to understand that this growth is going to impact you. Even though you may think, okay, well, that's a West County problem in terms of thinking about housing affordability. When people run out of places where they can afford to live in West County, they're going to start looking east. They're going to start coming to your community. And it's really baking that thinking into your long range planning. And I think one of the strategies that we've really been trying to engage in lately is thinking about how economic development initiatives and plans can incorporate nods to affordability and what those impacts are going to be on residential needs in a community. What are the industries you're trying to bring in? Who are they serving? Who's going to work there? What kind of jobs are you bringing in? And then on top of that, how is it going to expand your need for housing in your community? And how can you think about and really plugging in affordability into all of those plans? So it's coming up with that vision for the future, swing big, swing for the fences, plan for it. I mean, we have incredible data tools at our disposal, and so we can do a lot of really intricate planning and looking at very specific issues. And then we are trying to do the work to make sure that there's a real understanding of what the impacts on housing affordability are going to be. Because as we've seen our market just explode, 15 years ago, Wake County was very affordable. I think we're still relatively affordable compared to many places in the country, but it's a completely different picture from what it was in the past. And I think with some good forward-thinking planning, you can potentially get out ahead of at least some of those affordability issues.
Yeah, this is another one of my favorite subjects that we've stumbled into here, which is, for far too long, economic development conversations have been taking place completely separate from housing needs conversations, affordable housing, workforce housing, things of that nature. And, to be frank about it, I'm hearing people use those words in the same sentence a lot more, but I'm still kind of waiting for like some of those actual conversations, the kind of nuts and bolts of them to be figured out. As we think about, we want to bring in companies and manufacturers and all these kinds of things, but then at the end of the day, what is it they say? Housing is where jobs go to sleep at night, or something like that. And so, I think there's still a lot of ground to be made up in really bringing those conversations together, which brings me back to this conversation of partnerships and collaborative efforts and conversations. Are there ways, this is kind of for anybody who wants to take a stab at it, are there kind of best practices or examples you can share of communities or regional partnerships even who have really put some focus into building conversations, collaborative efforts from, kind of across sectors, right? Or across groups that are touching on this issue? Have you seen that happen? And I'd be curious to see if you could talk to us a little bit about how that might, how communities might start to seek that out. Ryan, go ahead and go first.
Okay, I'll kick it off. So we were fortunate in the last long session at the state budget as a region to get a $30 million direct appropriation to an organization that was propped up called the Strategic Development Commission. They earmarked 10 million of that 30 million to invest in housing initiatives, with more than half, or a little less than half of it being set aside for helping communities do this work. So a capacity building. Also put $2 million of that into a down payment assistance program to add to the state's already authorized down payment assistance program. So that was one group, and that group is made up of appointed officials by the governor and the President Pro Tem, but also our mayors and commissioners caucus and local officials as well. So that was one area where that came together, and we're really rolling that out in earnest across our entire region. The other thing, though, that when I spoke earlier about the home method, the optimization piece is really important. And so one of the things that we try and emphasize is helping local communities build out a nonprofit housing optimizer. So someone that can come alongside the local unit of government and help do the site selection and procurement, really identifying, sort of building out those strategies and being the boots on the ground to get the work done. So that when a group like ours, because we are a for-profit entity, but really philosophically operating like a nonprofit entity. The impact is to have the level of impact that we need boots on the ground partners. And so we've seen a lot of our local communities here and then others across the state that are very interested in sort of creating these optimizers or anointing an existing nonprofit in a community and as an optimizer, and then going through the training to be certified as such.
Andrea, I think this might be an opportunity to talk a little bit about the Hamilton County Housing Collaborative. Can you tell us a little bit about that initiative?
Sure. I mean, that feels like kind of amateur hour compared to what Ryan was talking about there. $30 million. That's awesome. So yeah, during COVID, a group of, it actually originated at the township trustee level, which is a unit of government, kind of the very most local unit of government that we have here in Indiana. Township trustees administer what's called township assistance. It used to be called poor relief. So for residents that are experiencing some sort of financial distress, that's kind of their place to go to the government to ask for assistance. And when COVID first hit in 2020, one of the township trustees who had been the trustee during the housing meltdown in 2008 said, you guys, this is going to be bad. People are going to lose their jobs. They're going to lose their homes. We need to figure out how to keep our residents housed. And so she convened us, HAND as our nonprofit housing developer, nonprofits that serve, that provide services to families experiencing or individuals experiencing housing insecurity, government, county government, various city and town governments, various funders, and just kind of got us all at the table and said, how are we going to address the situation? And we very quickly figured out, kind of where the gaps were in our population and who could serve them, and figured out a way that we could work together to not, sort of go after the same funding to serve the same people, but work together to go after different funding and serve more people. And we were very proud that, that worked very well. It went so smoothly that our government officials didn't really realize that there was any potential for a housing issue as a result of COVID. But the reality, and that we saw, we received a grant and provided some rent and mortgage assistance. And we expected the population that we would be served would be our clients, right? The folks with low incomes who are, kind of struggling to get by on a day-to-day basis. And we were shocked to find that we were hearing from the folks with the $5,000, $7,000 a month mortgages who, missing a week or two of work really put their housing at risk. And so, that I think opened a lot of people's eyes to the fact that this isn't just a those people problem. You can't tell by driving down a beautiful street who can pay their mortgage and who can't. So once the crisis of COVID passed, we sort of looked at each other and said, hey, we're together. It was more than 50 individuals representing dozens of organizations, said, how about if we came up with some sort of strategy or recommendation so that the next time something like this happens, we're not worried about people losing their housing. So we had a little bit of funding, nowhere near $30 million, but we had some funding available through emergency rental assistance programs and ARPA and, the various post-COVID funding to kind of do some research and identify what were some policy changes that we thought, if these changes were to be made, could really impact our housing future. And so we've been working since then to sort of implement. We identified 4 things we thought we could do much more quickly than we actually can, but 2 of them we're pushing forward on this year. And then the other 2 we realized before we could really make any progress on these, we need communities like Mark is describing and Ryan is describing that wholeheartedly believe we need housing options, not necessarily just affordable housing to the point Ryan was making. All housing helps. We have been underproducing housing since 2008 because we got nervous, and that's just complicating the problem. So long way of saying, so now we have this group that it's government, very cross-sector, government, nonprofit, business, there are developers, there are bankers. Bankers are very excited about this. And we're all working together to sort of pursue these different initiatives. One of them is a community land trust, which would allow us to kind of, we are growing very quickly and our prices are increasing ridiculously quickly, which isn't ridiculous if you own a home, but if you're trying to buy one, ridiculous. And so, community land trust would help preserve affordability. The other one we're pushing forward on is getting, and this kind of goes back to our first topic, and that's getting more philanthropic resources involved in that capital stack. There's some government grants that are pretty typically part of affordable housing capital stacks, but we're starting to see more community foundations and other kind of impact investment groups that want to use their funds to benefit the community, but also want to get them back. So that was the other initiative. And then what we're sort of sliding in is community engagement. Let's get people to realize, like, we're talking about your school bus driver. We're talking about your home healthcare aide. We're talking about the people that make our community better by being in it. So why in the world would we not have housing that they can afford? And that's, we think before we can really go after changing zoning regulations, which was one of, trying to revise zoning to make it friendlier, or establishing a dedicated funding source like a housing trust fund through, recording fees or plat fees or whatever. Before anybody is going to even think about either of those 2 things, they have to admit, yes, we need it. And we really just aren't there yet. There are just, and it's not that we have some leaders who understand we need it, but they just hear so much from the uninformed voters, neighbors who are afraid of what we're doing, and they just kind of skew the conversation. If elected officials only listen to the long range planners and the developers and the folks who really are boots on the ground and know this stuff, they wouldn't be as afraid. But they're listening to people who just don't have the knowledge that we have. So, okay, off my soapbox. I apologize for that.
No, that's okay. We've certainly encountered a lot of situations in which there seems to be an indirect relationship between knowledge about what you're talking about and the volume at which you're talking. We've certainly encountered that out in the world, in the wild, as they say. I do want to take a couple minutes because we're getting pretty close to the end of the hour here to make sure we have an opportunity to address some of the questions in the chat. We did have a question about from Carolyn Faulkner. It says for the market rate housing, 250,000 target is a great goal. What are the elements that could change this and make it possible to build? Are those laws, zoning, interest rates? What are the needs in the system? I know we addressed this a little bit already when we talked about policy, but anything else? I know we talked about bringing bankers into these collaborative kinds of conversations. So maybe we can touch a little bit on the possibility of looking at interest rates and bankers as collaborations here. Anybody have experience with that at all?
There are a number of, we actually had a very interesting partnership between our local community land trust, which is new, and a local lender who agreed to provide a below market interest rate mortgage product to community land trust buyers, which is very interesting. And banks still have CRA needs. And so I agree that bringing bankers to the table is an excellent way to approach that. I think looking at some of the other questions, what are all the elements that might make it possible? I think, and I would also look to, the developers on the call, I think it's kind of all of the above. You need to have land use ordinances that allow you to build a product that can be sold at that rate. You have to look at municipal building codes. If you have a community that needs, very fancy architectural features on every single unit that gets built in the community, that's going to make it harder to build and sell that $250,000 home. But at the end of the day, I think you need interest rates. I mean, there's got to be money at the table, whether it is a more below market mortgage product being provided to the buyers, or it is a soft subordinate mortgage program being provided through the local government or through a philanthropic organization, or whether it's direct capital investment. I think, from my opinion, and I think we see in North Carolina, there's a lot of push to kind of slash regulations as a solve for this. And I think that's part of the answer, but I think there's always going to be a role to play for the financial partners in solving this.
Andrea came off mute so fast. I want to hear what she has to say, but I will add just that to that a little bit. One of the other things that we've looked at, and this is directly in response to Carolyn's question, is, and Andrea talked about in South Bend, but infill housing. It's the biggest problem, or the largest, the hardest to close part of this capital stack gap is usually the infrastructure in the ground. And if you can find pad ready infill to eliminate some of the need for significant infrastructure investments, it's a lot easier for a builder to build a house and sell a house than to be a developer.
I don't know, I'm going to disappoint you, Ryan. It's not really that exciting, but one of the statistics that is pretty commonly tossed around is about 25% of the cost of a market rate home is tied almost directly to the development standards, right? The 60% has to be brick, everybody hates aluminum and vinyl, and, all of those types of, in our area, it's reactions to the fast growth that we had, that we were accepting all takers. And then as that stuff, those vinyl villages got thrown up, people said, oh, we didn't like that, so let's create rules so that can't happen again. And then that has just steadily increased the cost of what we do. And, there are perfectly fine, long-lasting, beautiful products that don't have brick or stone. And if we can acknowledge that, then that would help the cost.
There's just a quick anecdote. There is a community in our region here in Northeast Indiana. I won't name it, but they have very large cul-de-sac requirements because they don't want to buy a new fire truck.
Helpful. That's good. Thanks, Ryan. Yeah, we've certainly seen this exact kind of thing, right? Where there's seems to be these kinds of peculiar rationale for keeping the status quo in some cases. I do want to move on. We have a couple more. Sue Lindborg, who I believe is from a habitat agency, maybe even in Brown County, as it turns out, wonders about private developers partnering with habitat. I think this is an interesting concept, and I don't know if anybody's experienced or seen for-profit developers partnering with Habitat before. I wonder if some of the ways that Habitat, thinks about some of the volunteer work with construction. I don't know if there are some barriers in place for that, but has anybody seen anything like that happen?
Not so much at the project level in terms of sort of an internal subsidy type model, but we have seen some partnerships with market rate home builders who, if they negotiated with a town for the inclusion of some affordable lots, typically the home builder will as a first step, reach out to Habitat and volunteer to maybe give those lots to Habitat for them to develop. I've also heard of some other partnerships where maybe a home builder will sell homes at cost to a Habitat or another potential partner for them to sell as affordable homeownership housing. So I think there's a lot of, we love our Habitat affiliate. We've been working with them more, making direct investments, but I think these creative types of partnerships with habitats, with community land trusts, I think there's a lot of untapped potential there.
Yeah, I know we were just, Mark, you and I have heard from your local Habitat there about some of the interesting new like ground lease models and some interesting things that they've been doing down there as well. You know what, we're right at the end of the call, so Hope, I'm so sorry if we didn't get to your question about public-private partnerships and CDFIs, but we'll make sure to include my email address, and I'm happy to field any questions that we didn't get to. Thank you, the three of you, so much for joining us. I really appreciate it. I can't believe an hour is already up, but certainly I don't mean to take any more of your time. So thank you all very much, and thanks to everybody who joined us. As I said, we will have a recording of this on our TPMA website, probably later this afternoon/evening. So thank you all again so much, and we'll talk to you all next time. Have a great day.
Thank you all.
For having us.